Have you ever noticed that curious contradiction? How the religion founded on love often seems to produce such fear. It's one of those paradoxes hiding in plain sight, so deeply embedded in Christian psychology that we rarely pause to question it. Consider the pattern. Love thy neighbor becomes a moral command enforced by threat of divine punishment. The unconditional acceptance attributed to Jesus transforms into conditional approval based on belief and behavior. The spontaneous compassion of the Gospels calcifies into rigid moral obligation. There's something almost suspicious about this transformation. Why would a message supposedly centered on love become so thoroughly intertwined with fear, guilt, and moral compulsion? The contradiction extends beyond mere observation into theological framework itself. God loves you, but will condemn you to eternal torment if you don't love him back. Jesus died for your sins out of love, creating a debt you can never fully repay. Love your enemies or face divine judgment. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Love is consistently presented not as free gift, but as moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. There's something almost too convenient about this framing, as if love functions less as spontaneous expression and more as sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral control. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently Christian love coincides with fear of judgment. The believer who loves God primarily to avoid hellfire. The Christian who performs acts of charity partly to secure divine favor. The follower who obeys biblical commandments to love out of fear of punishment for disobedience. There's something curious about this pattern, as if love functions not as free expression, but as response to implicit threat, not as spontaneous connection, but as transaction motivated by spiritual self-preservation. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if Christian love isn't primarily about spontaneous compassion, but about psychological control? What if the love most celebrated by Christianity actually represents fear, disguised as its opposite? What if the message of unconditional love attributed to Jesus has been systematically transformed into sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral obligation, turning what was free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Christian spirituality, challenging our most basic assumptions about religious virtue and moral development. If Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion but as disguised fear of judgment, how might this distort believers' relationship to themselves, to others, and to the divine? What might become possible if we distinguished between authentic love and the psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious virtue? A philosopher whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological mechanisms by which virtues establish and maintain their power. A thinker who dared to ask whether our most celebrated spiritual qualities might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind Christianity's celebration of love lurks something much less divine, a sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise, conditional approval into moral obligation, spiritual self-preservation into virtue? What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to question the psychological foundation of Christian love? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these foundations hidden? What if the ultimate spiritual liberation isn't cultivating perfect Christian love, but recognizing the disguised fear that often motivates it? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology. They offer a perspective on love, not as divine commandment, but as human possibility. Love liberated from obligation, fear, and moral compulsion. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in Christian love that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent, it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar transformation of love, from spontaneous expression into moral obligation, from free gift into spiritual debt, from natural human connection into divine commandment. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how Christianity systematically transforms what was supposedly free gift into eternal obligation, enforced by spiritual consequences. Consider how Christian love typically manifests. The believer loves God partly to secure salvation and avoid damnation. The Christian loves neighbors as moral duty rather than spontaneous connection. The follower performs acts of kindness partly to fulfill divine commandment. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Love coincides not with freedom but with obligation, not with spontaneity but with moral requirement, not with natural human connection but with spiritual transaction motivated partly by self-preservation. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse expressions of Christian spirituality. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Love transforms from spontaneous expression into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, from free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in religious language. Christian teachings consistently frame love not merely as natural human connection, but as divine commandment. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Love your enemies. Love one another as I have loved you. The pattern continues. Love is presented not simply as spontaneous expression, but as moral obligation. Not merely as human possibility, but as divine requirement enforced by spiritual consequences. This framing suggests function beyond mere connection, obligation that transforms natural human capacity into moral duty. The anomaly extends beyond language into psychological experience. Those most devoted to Christian love often experience it not simply as spontaneous compassion, but as moral requirement, loving God partly out of fear of judgment, loving neighbors partly to fulfill divine commandment, loving enemies partly to secure spiritual approval. The pattern repeats. Love coincides not with freedom, but with obligation, not with natural human connection, but with transaction motivated partly by spiritual self-preservation. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss Christian love, compassion, and charity at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation. How consistently love transforms from spontaneous expression into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how perfectly Christian love functions as a sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral control through transformation of what was supposedly free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that Christian love might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if the love most celebrated by Christianity functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral obligation? What if the message of unconditional love, attributed to Jesus, has been systematically transformed into something quite different? Love as transaction rather than gift, as obligation rather than freedom, as response to implicit threat rather than spontaneous connection. This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religious psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether Christianity's most celebrated virtue might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between love and fear? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if Christian love represents fear disguised as its opposite? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. They called it love when it was merely fear of being condemned. In the summer of 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most controversial works, The Antichrist. At 44, he was entering the final productive period before his mental collapse. though still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. He lived in near isolation, moving between cheap lodgings across Europe as his meager pension allowed. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by failure and suffering. It was within this context of physical pain and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most disturbing insights about the psychology of Christian virtue. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine religious psychology. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian virtue from the inside. He was raised in an environment saturated with talk of divine love, where this quality was consistently presented as the supreme spiritual ideal. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether this celebrated virtue might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly acknowledged. What made Nietzsche's perspective on Christian love especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had been immersed in Christian teaching from childhood, yet possessed the rare psychological insight to question its hidden functions. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Might the virtues most celebrated by mainstream religion actually represent sophisticated psychological mechanisms serving purposes quite different from their explicit claims? Could the love praised by conventional Christianity actually disguise a peculiar form of fear? Fear of divine judgment, fear of eternal punishment, fear of moral condemnation. During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as a sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise, converting anxiety about divine judgment into obligation disguised as virtue, spiritual self-preservation into moral duty, conditional approval into eternal debt. Behind the mask of the loving believer, he suggested, often lurks a particular form of fear more insidious precisely because it presents itself as fear's opposite. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis: that Christian love emerged not primarily from spontaneous compassion, but from psychological response to perceived threat. Specifically, the threat of divine judgment transformed into moral obligation, disguised as virtue. As he would later write in The Antichrist, Christianity was from the beginning, essentially and fundamentally, life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as, faith in another or better life. This wasn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project: the transformation of natural human vitality into something requiring constant moral management disguised as spiritual virtue. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from anti-religious animus, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how Christian virtue actually functions in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently love coincides not with freedom but with obligation, not with spontaneity but with moral requirement, not with natural human connection, but with transaction motivated partly by spiritual self-preservation. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological function of this celebrated virtue: not spontaneous compassion, but disguised fear of judgment. It was this recognition of the hidden psychological function of Christian love that gave Nietzsche's moral critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting religious virtue as misguided, he was uncovering what he saw as its hidden psychological purpose: not spontaneous compassion, but disguised fear; not free expression, but moral obligation; not natural human connection, but sophisticated transaction motivated partly by spiritual self-preservation. As he would write in Ecce Homo, Christianity is the mortal enmity against the masters of the earth, against the noble. Christianity is a revolt of all things that crawl on the ground against that which has height. This wasn't mere polemic, but recognition that Christian virtues function as integral elements of sophisticated psychological system that transforms natural human vitality into something requiring constant moral management disguised as spiritual virtue. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how love functions psychologically within Christian morality. It wasn't merely a critique of specific virtues, but a profound insight into how religious psychology operates beneath its explicit claims. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of love, freedom, and authentic human connection beyond the confines of religious obligation? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of Christian texts and teachings. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how love was presented across Christian tradition. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic transformation of love from spontaneous expression into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, from free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. In The Antichrist, published posthumously in 1895 but written in 1888, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that Christian love often functions contrary to this natural human psychology, not enhancing vital power, but constraining it through moral obligation, not expressing natural human connection, but establishing spiritual transaction, motivated partly by fear of judgment. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christianity's emphasis on love, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function, how it systematically transforms what was supposedly spontaneous expression into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. Christian love doesn't simply celebrate human connection. It establishes sophisticated moral framework that converts natural human capacity into divine commandment, with implicit threat for non-compliance. Love thy neighbor as thyself, or face spiritual consequences. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christian teachings frame the relationship between divine love and human obligation. From the concept of salvation through Christ's sacrifice, creating debt believers can never fully repay, to moral commandments to love with implicit threat of divine judgment for failure, Christian tradition consistently presents love not merely as gift but as transaction, not simply as spontaneous connection, but as moral obligation with spiritual consequences for non-compliance. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Love functions as a sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral control through transformation of what was supposedly free gift into eternal debt. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how love functions in religious psychology. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die of it, certainly, but degenerated to vice. This wasn't mere rhetorical flourish, but recognition of how Christianity transformed natural human love into something requiring constant moral management, converting spontaneous connection into transaction governed by spiritual bookkeeping, natural human vitality, into something requiring approval from divine authority. The pattern continued. Love functions not as free expression, but as response to implicit threat, not as spontaneous connection, but as obligation motivated partly by fear of judgment. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how love manifests in believers' actual psychological experience. He noted how consistently the loving believer maintains sense of spiritual transaction despite professed selflessness, loving God partly to secure salvation, loving neighbors as moral duty rather than spontaneous connection, performing acts of kindness partly to fulfill divine commandment. The pattern was consistent. Love coincides not with freedom, but with obligation, not with natural human connection, but with transaction motivated partly by spiritual self-preservation. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise. As he writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound psychological insight. Even as belief in divine judgment fades, the moral obligation established through transformation of love into spiritual transaction often persists, continuing to shape human psychology through sophisticated disguise of fear as virtue. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across Christian texts, teachings, and psychological manifestations. The same correlation appears again and again. Love coincides not with freedom, but with obligation, not with spontaneity, but with moral requirement, not with natural human connection, but with transaction motivated partly by spiritual self-preservation. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the psychological mechanism of Christian love emerged from what he saw as fundamental transformation of Jesus' original message, the gradual conversion of what may have been spontaneous compassion into sophisticated system of moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the transformation of love from spontaneous expression into moral obligation wasn't merely incidental, but essential to what he saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project. The specific theological details might change across Christian traditions, but the basic pattern remained consistent. Love functions not primarily as free gift, but as sophisticated transaction with implicit spiritual consequences, converting what was supposedly spontaneous compassion into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche expanded this analysis through his controversial distinction between Jesus and Christianity. The very word Christianity is a misunderstanding. At bottom, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. This provocative statement reveals Nietzsche's understanding that the historical Jesus may have embodied spontaneous compassion, fundamentally different from the theological system later constructed around him, system that gradually transformed what may have been free expression into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. As he further explains, what the Gospels call God's kingdom is essentially nothing more than the heart's experience that there is no contradiction between God and man, that nothing distant is necessary to unite man with what was previously called God, but is now experienced as the divine essence of existence. No one, in all the history of the Gospels, was ever compelled to recognize God as something external to himself. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological transformation wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in the lived experience of Christian morality. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "It is not his love of men, but the impotence of his love of men that hinders the Christian of today from burning us." This isn't mere polemic, but profound psychological observation. Christian love often functions not as spontaneous compassion, but as moral obligation that simultaneously creates framework for judgment, transforming natural human connection into something requiring approval from divine authority and establishing conditions for condemning those who fail to meet its standards. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how Christianity functions psychologically, not primarily to enhance human connection, but to establish moral control through sophisticated transformation of what was possibly Jesus' spontaneous compassion into system of obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. By celebrating love as supreme virtue, while simultaneously presenting it as divine commandment with implicit threat for non-compliance, Christianity effectively established moral framework that converts natural human capacity into something requiring constant management according to religious standards, transforming what was possibly free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that Christian love represents not the absence of fear, but its most ingenious disguise. As he writes in The Antichrist, "One has deprived reality of its value, its meaning, its truthfulness, to precisely the extent to which one has mendaciously invented an ideal world, the true world and the apparent world, in plain terms, the mendaciously invented world and reality. This isn't mere metaphysical argument, but recognition that Christian transformation of love into moral obligation effectively creates psychological division where natural human connection becomes subject to spiritual evaluation, converting spontaneous expression into transaction governed by religious bookkeeping and establishing what was possibly Jesus's free compassion as eternal debt that believers can never fully repay. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise, converting anxiety about divine judgment into obligation presented as virtue, spiritual self-preservation into moral duty, conditional approval into eternal debt. Behind the language of unconditional love lurks conditional framework, where connection becomes subject to spiritual evaluation and natural human capacity transforms into something requiring approval from divine authority. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological appeal of Christian love lies precisely in its capacity to transform fear into virtue without requiring acknowledgement of that fear. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, morality in Europe today is herd animal morality. This isn't mere provocative statement, but recognition that Christian transformation of love into moral obligation effectively establishes a sophisticated system of psychological control where natural human connection becomes subject to spiritual evaluation according to religious standards. What implications might this understanding have for our conception of love, freedom, and authentic human connection? And what might it reveal about the possibility of love beyond moral obligation and the fear of judgment that often underlies it? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion, that Christian love represents not the absence of fear, but its most sophisticated disguise, fear's most ingenious strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of Christian morality. The psychological mechanism of love wasn't isolated to particular theological details or specific religious practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout the entire moral system. The pattern was clear. Love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as a sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral obligation, converting what was supposedly free gift into eternal debt enforced by spiritual consequences, transforming natural human connection into transaction motivated partly by fear of judgment. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity through his controversial analysis of Paul's role in transforming Jesus' message. The glad tidings were followed by the very worst, those of Paul. In Paul was embodied the opposite type to that of the bearer of glad tidings, the genius in hatred, in the vision of hatred, in the inexorable logic of hatred. How much this disangelist sacrificed to hatred. Above all, the Savior. He nailed him to his cross. The life, the example, the teaching, the death, the meaning, and the right of the entire gospel. Nothing remained once this hate-inspired counterfeiter realized what alone he could use. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that what may have been Jesus' spontaneous compassion gradually transformed after his death into a sophisticated system of moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. System where love functions less as free expression and more as transaction, governed by religious bookkeeping. The pattern revealed itself in how Christianity approaches divine love and human obligation. Rather than presenting divine compassion as free gift without obligation, Christian theology consistently establishes framework of spiritual transaction. God loves humanity but demands belief, worship, and moral compliance in return. Christ's sacrifice creates debt believers can never fully repay. Divine compassion establishes eternal obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. The pattern continued. Love functions not as spontaneous expression, but as sophisticated transaction, with implicit threat for non-compliance. In Christian approaches to human love, the same pattern appeared. Rather than presenting compassion as natural human connection, Christian morality consistently frames it as divine commandment. Love thy neighbor as thyself becomes moral obligation rather than spontaneous expression. Love your enemies becomes spiritual requirement rather than natural human possibility. Love one another as I have loved you becomes divine command with implicit consequences for failure. The pattern persisted. Love functions not as free gift, but as moral duty, not as natural human connection, but as spiritual obligation enforced by religious framework. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in Christian conceptions of salvation.
Rather than presenting divine compassion without condition, salvation theology consistently establishes sophisticated spiritual transaction. Christ's sacrifice creates debt. Believers can never fully repay. Divine love demands response of belief, worship, and moral compliance. Eternal life becomes conditional reward rather than free gift.
The pattern repeated. Love functions as mechanism for establishing moral obligation through transformation of what was supposedly free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian morality. Whether in conceptions of divine love, approaches to human compassion, or frameworks of salvation, the same psychological mechanism operated. Love functions not as spontaneous expression, but as moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, converting natural human connection into transaction motivated partly by fear of judgment. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, Christianity is the mortal enmity against the masters of the earth, against the noble. Christianity is a revolt of all things that crawl on the ground against that which has height. This isn't mere polemic, but recognition of how Christianity systematically transforms natural human vitality into something requiring constant moral management disguised as spiritual virtue. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that Christian love represents not the absence of fear, but its most ingenious disguise. The loving believer hasn't truly abandoned fear of judgment, but merely disguised it behind mask of virtue, converting anxiety about divine punishment into moral obligation presented as spiritual achievement, fear of condemnation into transaction, disguised as compassion, conditional approval into eternal debt presented as free gift but never fully dischargeable. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise? What if the message of unconditional love attributed to Jesus has been systematically transformed into something quite different? Love as transaction rather than gift, as obligation rather than freedom, as response to implicit threat rather than spontaneous connection. What if authentic love might be possible beyond the moral obligation and disguised fear that characterize its Christian formulation? This recognition wasn't merely academic observation, but profound challenge to how we understand love, freedom, and authentic human connection. If Christian love functions primarily as disguised form of fear and obligation rather than spontaneous compassion, what might become possible if we sought authentic connection beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into spiritual transaction? What form of love might emerge if we distinguished between genuine compassion and the sophisticated obligation disguised as virtue that characterizes its Christian formulation? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand love, freedom, and authentic human connection. If Christian love functions not primarily as spontaneous compassion, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise, then addressing this insight requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of how we approach human connection. Not merely revised understanding of love, but transformed conception of authentic compassion beyond the moral obligation and disguised fear that characterize its Christian formulation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the gift-giving virtue, Love that emerges not from obligation, but from overflowing vitality, not from fear of judgment, but from natural human abundance. I love him who squanders his soul, who neither seeks nor offers thanks, because he always gives and does not want to preserve himself. This passage reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Authentic love might emerge not from moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, but from natural human vitality beyond religious framework. Not from transaction governed by divine bookkeeping, but from spontaneous expression of life's fundamental energy. The first profound implication is psychological. If Christian love often functions as disguised form of fear and obligation, authentic human connection requires psychological honesty beyond conventional virtue. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't mere self-help slogan, but recognition that genuine compassion emerges not from moral framework that transforms natural capacity into spiritual transaction, but from authentic engagement with one's actual nature, not through disguised fear of judgment, but through honest expression of human connection beyond religious obligation. The second implication is spiritual. If Christian love represents sophisticated transformation of what may have been Jesus' spontaneous compassion into system of moral obligation, authentic spiritual understanding might require a different approach altogether. As Nietzsche suggests in The Antichrist through his controversial distinction between Jesus and Christianity, the kingdom of heaven is a state of the heart, not something that comes upon the earth or after death. The whole concept of natural death is lacking in the gospel. Death is not a bridge, not a passing. It is absent because it belongs to a quite different, a merely apparent world, useful only as a symbol. This isn't mere rejection of Christian theology, but recognition that authentic spiritual insight might emerge beyond the transformation of love into moral obligation, not through sophisticated transaction with implicit spiritual consequences, but through direct engagement with life's fundamental reality. The third implication is ethical. If traditional morality transforms natural human connection into sophisticated system of obligation, authentic ethical development requires values beyond moral frameworks that convert compassion into transaction. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, what is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that authentic connection might emerge not from moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, but from natural human capacity beyond religious framework, not through transaction governed by divine bookkeeping, but through spontaneous expression, unmediated by fear of judgment. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If conventional love functions primarily as psychological mechanism that transforms fear into its disguise, authentic human connection might require liberation from the sophisticated obligation of traditional virtue. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes. This isn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition that authentic compassion might emerge beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality, not through virtues that transform natural human connection into spiritual transaction, but through direct expression, unmediated by religious framework. What does this mean for our understanding of love, freedom, and authentic human connection? If Christian love functions primarily as disguised form of fear and obligation rather than spontaneous compassion, what might become possible if we sought authentic connection beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into spiritual transaction? What form of love might emerge if we distinguished between genuine compassion and the sophisticated obligation disguised as virtue that characterizes its Christian formulation? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic human connection begins not with more perfect cultivation of conventional virtue, but with psychological honesty beyond the disguised fear of traditional morality. The liberation from sophisticated obligation of Christian love might open possibilities for compassion that neither traditional believers nor critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging from what Nietzsche saw as natural human vitality, beyond the moral framework that transforms connection into transaction. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific theological details into what might be called a conspiracy of virtue, a collective cultural agreement to transform natural human connection into moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project, the transformation of natural human vitality into something requiring constant management according to religious standards. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Western morality. What began as possibly spontaneous compassion gradually transformed into a sophisticated system of obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. Natural human connection steadily converted into transaction governed by religious bookkeeping. Direct expression progressively channeled into moral framework with implicit threat for non-compliance. The specific theological details changed across religious history, but the basic psychological mechanism remained consistent. Love functioned as a sophisticated method for establishing moral control through transformation of what was supposedly free gift into eternal debt that can never be fully discharged. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental approach to human psychology. As he writes in The Antichrist, "What is bad? All that stems from weakness, not contentedness but more power, not peace at any price but war, not virtue but efficiency. The weak and the failures shall perish, first principle of our love of humanity, and they shall even be given every possible assistance." This provocative passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that Christianity's approach to compassion often functions contrary to natural human psychology, not enhancing vital power, but constraining it through moral obligation, not expressing spontaneous connection, but establishing spiritual transaction, motivated partly by fear of judgment. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of Western culture. Religious institutions celebrate love as supreme virtue, while simultaneously presenting it as divine commandment, with implicit threat for non-compliance. Educational systems often perpetuate the psychological patterns established by this moral framework. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce rather than challenge the transformation of natural human connection into sophisticated transaction. Each domain develops its own language, but the basic psychological mechanism often remains consistent: the conversion of what might be spontaneous compassion into moral obligation enforced by consequences. The conspiracy extends into how we conceptualize personal development itself, often framing it as increasing conformity to moral ideals rather than authentic expression of natural human capacity. It appears in how we approach relationships, frequently emphasizing obligation over spontaneity. It emerges in how we understand spiritual growth, commonly defining it in terms of virtuous compliance rather than direct engagement with life's fundamental reality. The pattern persists. Human connection continues to be framed largely through psychological mechanisms established by traditional morality, even in seemingly secular contexts. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse cultural contexts. As traditional Christian theology loses cultural authority in certain contexts, the same basic psychological mechanism often continues through secular forms. The transformation of natural human connection into sophisticated obligation without explicit religious language, the disguising of fear behind seemingly selfless virtue, the conversion of spontaneous expression into transaction governed by implicit consequences. Different conceptual details, same basic psychological mechanism, the transformation of what might be free gift into debt through sophisticated moral framework. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that Christian love disguises fear, but that this psychological pattern persists even as specific theological content evolves, that behind diverse approaches to virtue often lurks the same basic psychological mechanism, the transformation of natural human connection into moral obligation, enforced by consequences. The real conspiracy isn't specific theological content, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming spontaneous expression into sophisticated transaction, process that effectively converts what might be free gift into eternal debt disguised as virtue. This pattern raises profound questions about love, freedom, and the possibility of authentic human connection beyond the moral frameworks that convert natural capacity into spiritual transaction. If conventional love functions primarily as disguised form of fear and obligation, what might become possible if we sought authentic connection beyond the sophisticated transaction of traditional virtue? What form of compassion might emerge if we distinguished between spontaneous expression and the moral obligation enforced by consequences that characterizes its traditional formulation? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged, and what it might mean for the possibility of authentic human connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional virtue. Why has the transformation of love from spontaneous expression into moral obligation remained largely unacknowledged, despite its profound influence on Western psychology? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the appearance that Christian love represents genuine compassion rather than sophisticated form of fear and obligation. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but the very psychological foundations of our most celebrated virtue, a prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional moral frameworks. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility, and few psychological mechanisms are more useful for establishing moral control than the transformation of natural human connection into transaction governed by spiritual consequences. By maintaining the appearance that Christian love represents spontaneous compassion rather than disguised form of fear and obligation, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that our most celebrated virtue might emerge from psychological mechanisms quite different from their explicit claims. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that love represents genuine compassion rather than sophisticated form of fear and obligation. Their authority depends fundamentally on their claim to promote authentic virtue rather than psychological control, to cultivate genuine connection rather than establish transaction governed by spiritual consequences. Acknowledging the disguised fear and obligation of conventional love would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific theological details but the very psychological basis of religious virtue. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that love represents spontaneous compassion rather than disguised form of fear and obligation. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying love as genuine connection, rather than sophisticated psychological mechanism. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present conventional virtue as authentic compassion rather than disguised form of fear and obligation, as spontaneous expression rather than transaction governed by spiritual consequences. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic connection rather than sophisticated psychological control. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that love represents genuine compassion rather than disguised form of fear and obligation. As Nietzsche writes in Human, All Too Human, Christianity wants to destroy, shatter, stun, intoxicate. There is only one thing that it does not want: moderation. And for this reason, it is in its deepest meaning barbaric, Asiatic, ignoble, un-Greek. This provocative passage reveals how moral education might serve not just to transmit specific ethical content, but to maintain the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic connection rather than sophisticated psychological control, that love represents spontaneous compassion rather than disguised form of fear and obligation. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God. Not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly Western psychology has been shaped by the transformation of natural human connection into transaction governed by spiritual consequences. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of conventional virtue to the more demanding terrain of authentic connection, beyond the disguised fear and obligation of traditional morality. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting moral narratives over disturbing psychological insights, for virtues that transform natural capacity into spiritual transaction over honest acknowledgement of human connection beyond religious framework, and for love defined through traditional concepts over authentic compassion beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional morality. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound cultural observation. Even as the psychological foundations of traditional virtue become increasingly questionable, moral systems continue displaying the shadow of these foundations, the conceptual remnants of psychological mechanisms whose actual function remains largely unacknowledged. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional love? If traditional virtue often functions as sophisticated psychological control rather than genuine compassion, what might become possible if we sought authentic connection beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into spiritual transaction? What form of love might emerge if we distinguished between spontaneous expression and the disguised fear and obligation that characterize its traditional formulation? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of authentic human connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional love, not through rejection of compassion, but through liberation from the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction, motivated partly by fear of judgment. The final question isn't whether love is valuable, but whether conventional love represents genuine compassion or disguised form of fear and obligation. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about Christian psychology: how consistently this celebrated virtue functions as sophisticated mechanism for transforming natural human connection into moral transaction governed by spiritual consequences. But it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of authentic connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional virtue, not through rejection of compassion, but through liberation from the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction, motivated partly by fear of judgment. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the gift-giving virtue, love that emerges not from obligation, but from overflowing vitality, not from fear of judgment, but from natural human abundance. I love him who squanders his soul, who neither seeks nor offers thanks, because he always gives and does not want to preserve himself. This isn't rejection of compassion, but recognition that authentic connection might emerge beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into spiritual transaction, not through obligation enforced by consequences, but through spontaneous expression of life's fundamental energy. This isn't about embracing selfishness or rejecting human connection, but transforming how we understand these concepts, recognizing that authentic compassion might emerge not through conventional virtue, but through natural human capacity beyond religious framework. Perhaps the truly loving person isn't one who fulfills moral obligation out of fear of judgment, but one who expresses spontaneous connection without need for spiritual transaction, not through virtues that transform natural capacity into sophisticated obligation, but through direct engagement with life unmediated by religious bookkeeping. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to conventional love, noticing when it functions not as spontaneous compassion but as sophisticated form of fear and obligation. It means asking whether your conception of connection emerges from natural human capacity or from moral framework that transforms that capacity into spiritual transaction. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "I should love my neighbor," or "God commands us to love," not to express genuine compassion, but to establish obligation motivated partly by fear of judgment. It means developing approach to human connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional virtue. Not through rejection of compassion, but through direct engagement with life beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction. It means approaching love, not primarily through religious obligation, but through spontaneous expression, unmediated by fear of spiritual consequences. It means recognizing the possibility of authentic connection that doesn't require either moral commandment or implicit threat for non-compliance. Most importantly, it means understanding that liberation from the disguised fear and obligation of conventional love doesn't require rejection of compassion, that authentic connection might emerge precisely through direct engagement with life beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction. This isn't abandonment of love, but it's transformation, relationship to others beyond the psychological mechanisms that convert spontaneous expression into obligation, motivated partly by fear of judgment. The path forward isn't about rejecting compassion, but liberating connection from the disguised fear and obligation of conventional virtue. Whether within traditional spiritual frameworks or beyond them, authentic love requires distinguishing between genuine compassion and the sophisticated transaction of moral obligation enforced by consequences, between spontaneous expression and the psychological mechanism that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated obligation, motivated partly by fear of judgment. What might become possible if you distinguished between genuine compassion and the disguised fear and obligation of conventional love? What form of connection might emerge beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction? What relationship to others might you discover beyond the psychological mechanisms that convert spontaneous expression into obligation, motivated partly by fear of judgment? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect cultivation of conventional virtue, but from direct engagement with life beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic connection begins precisely where conventional love ends, with recognition that they called it love when it was merely fear of being condemned. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that compassion lacks value, but that authentic connection emerges beyond the disguised fear and obligation of conventional virtue, and that genuine love doesn't need either the Church's permission or Jesus' sacrifice, just the courage to engage life directly without the mediation of religious transaction. The real journey isn't perfecting conventional love, but discovering authentic connection beyond the disguised fear and obligation of traditional virtue. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that what Christianity calls love often represents fear disguised as its opposite, and that genuine compassion emerges not through moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, but through direct engagement with life beyond the psychological mechanisms that transform natural human capacity into sophisticated transaction, motivated partly by fear of judgment.